In the heart of Savannah, Georgia, a picturesque southern city filled with oak-lined streets and historic buildings, Kaya lived a peaceful life with his mother, Grace. Grace was a warm, loving woman who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. Her gentle nature made her beloved by everyone who knew her, especially Kaya. At 13, Kaya was an introspective boy, spending most of his free time reading books and exploring the city's parks with his mother. Kaya's father, Alan, was a businessman who worked long hours and rarely spent time with his family. He was cold and distant, showing little interest in his son's life. However, Kaya didn't mind much, as he had all the love and attention he needed from his mother. The two of them were inseparable, sharing quiet moments in the garden, reading together, and laughing over Kaya's school stories. But as idyllic as life seemed, dark clouds loomed over the horizon. Kaya had noticed his father's strange behavior recently, secretive phone calls, late-night meetings, and whispered conversations with Rebecca, his stepmother. Kaya often overheard them arguing, but Grace always reassured him that everything would be fine. Yet, deep down, Kaya sensed something was wrong. Kaya's world came crashing down one fateful afternoon. He was at school when the principal called him to the office. The look on her face told him everything before she even spoke. His mother had been in a car accident. Kaya sat frozen as the principal's words blurred into the background. His mother, the one person who had always been there for him, was gone. When Alan arrived at the school, his face was blank. He offered no comfort, no words of solace, only a cold, emotionless presence that made Kaya's grief even heavier. Alan brought Kaya home, but the house no longer felt like home. It was silent, empty, devoid of the warmth that Grace had always filled it with. At the funeral, Kaya watched as people offered their condolences, but he felt disconnected from it all. His mother's death didn't feel real. The house was filled with the scent of flowers, the murmur of visitors, and yet all Kaya could feel was the gaping hole in his chest. He longed for his mother's voice, her touch, but all that was left were memories. A week after the funeral, Alan informed Kaya that they were moving to a different part of Savannah. It wasn't up for discussion. Kaya had no say, just as he had no say in anything since his mother passed. Alan claimed that the old house had too many painful memories and that a fresh start would do them good. But Kaya knew better. He saw the way Rebecca, his stepmother, eyed the house with contempt, as though it held no value now that Grace was gone. The new apartment was located in the heart of downtown Savannah, a stark contrast to the suburban neighborhood Kaya had grown up in. The building was tall, gray, and impersonal, with none of the charm or warmth of their old home. Kaya's room was much smaller than his previous one, and the walls seemed to close in on him each night. There were no memories of his mother here, no familiar scents, no soft cushion she had sewn herself, nothing that reminded him of the life he once knew. Rebecca, who had always been distant, now became openly hostile. She never spoke to Kaya unless it was to bark orders at him, and she made it clear that she didn't want him around. Alan, preoccupied with his work, left early in the morning and returned late at night, leaving Kaya and Rebecca alone in a cold, tense silence. Kaya tried to cope, but he felt increasingly trapped. His grief was suffocating, and with no one to turn to, the weight of his mother's absence grew heavier by the day. Rebecca's cutting remarks and Alan's indifference made Kaya feel like an unwelcome guest in his own life. It wasn't just the loss of his mother that hurt, it was the realization that no one was there to protect him anymore. One evening, as Kaya lay in bed, unable to sleep, he overheard his father and Rebecca arguing in the living room. Their voices were hushed but tense, and curiosity got the better of him. Quietly, Kaya crept to the top of the stairs, listening intently to their conversation. "I told you we had to act fast," Rebecca hissed. "Do you know how much longer this can go on before someone starts asking questions?" Alan's voice was low, but Kaya could hear the frustration in it. "I'm handling it, Rebecca. You need to calm down." "Calm down? You think the police will calm down when they find out? You think the bank will just sit back and wait? We're running out of time." Kaya's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't understand exactly what they were talking about, but it sounded like they were hiding something important. His mind raced, trying to connect the dots. What did they mean by running out of time? And why were they so afraid of the police? The argument ended abruptly when Rebecca noticed Kaya at the top of the stairs. She shot him a sharp glare. "What are you doing out of bed?" Kaya mumbled something about getting a drink of water and quickly retreated to his room. But the seeds of doubt had already been planted. He began to question everything: his mother's accident, the move to the new apartment, and most of all, his father's strange behavior. Kaya had always thought of his father as distant but honest. Now, he wasn't so sure. As the days passed, Kaya's suspicions grew. He started paying closer attention to the things his father and Rebecca said, noticing the small slips in their words, the way they avoided talking about his mother, and how Rebecca seemed unusually fixated on financial matters. One day, while searching for a school book in Alan's office, Kaya stumbled upon a stack of legal documents hidden in a drawer. Curiosity piqued, Kaya carefully sifted through the papers. What he found made his stomach drop: documents related to his mother's estate. According to the papers, Grace had left behind a substantial inheritance for Kaya, money that was supposed to be put into a trust for his future. But instead, it appeared that Alan and Rebecca had been using it to cover their own expenses. Kaya's hands shook as he read through the details. His father had been lying to him. He wasn't just neglecting Kaya emotionally, he was actively taking what rightfully belonged to him. Kaya felt a surge of anger, mixed with a deep sense of betrayal. How could Alan, his own father, do this to him? And Rebecca, she was clearly in on it too, manipulating Alan for her own gain. That night, Kaya confronted his father, demanding an explanation. Alan's reaction was cold and defensive. "You don't understand how these things work, Kaya," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm handling your mother's affairs the best way I know how." "But it's my money." Kaya shot back, his voice trembling with emotion. "You're using it for yourself." Rebecca, who had been listening from the kitchen, stepped in, her eyes flashing with anger. "You ungrateful brat. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? Your mother would be ashamed of you." Kaya's heart ached at the mention of his mother, but he refused to back down. He knew what they were doing was wrong, and he wasn't going to let them get away with it. But deep down, he also knew that standing up to them would come at a cost. Rebecca was more dangerous than he'd ever realized, and Alan was no longer the father he thought he knew. The atmosphere at home became unbearable. Kaya was now an outcast in his own family, treated like a nuisance, an unwanted guest. Rebecca took every opportunity to belittle him, and Alan, instead of defending his son, withdrew even further. Kaya found himself alone most of the time, with no one to turn to for support. In an attempt to escape the oppressive environment, Kaya started spending his afternoons at Forsyth Park, a sprawling green space in the heart of Savannah. It was one of the few places in the city that still held happy memories for him, memories of picnics with his mother, of her laughter echoing through the trees. Sitting on a bench by the fountain, Kaya would often close his eyes and pretend that she was still there, that everything was still normal. But the reality was far different. Each night, he returned to a house that no longer felt like home. Rebecca's cruel remarks and Alan's indifference were like knives to his already wounded heart. He began to withdraw from school as well, his grades slipping, his friendships fading. It seemed like no one noticed his pain, no one except for Miss Martha. Miss Martha was an elderly woman who often sat in the park reading a book, her small dog curled up at her feet. She had a kind face, wrinkled with age but full of warmth. One afternoon, when Kaya was sitting on his usual bench, staring blankly at the fountain, Miss Martha approached him. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders, young man," she said gently. "Mind if I sit with you?" Kaya shrugged, not sure how to respond, but something about her presence was comforting. As they sat in silence, Miss Martha didn't pry, didn't ask questions, she simply sat with him, as if she understood that sometimes words weren't necessary. From that day on, Kaya found himself looking forward to his afternoons in the park. Miss Martha became a quiet presence in his life, offering him kindness without asking for anything in return. She reminded him of his mother in some ways, her gentleness, her wisdom. And though Kaya never told her about the turmoil at home, he knew that she could sense his pain. Over the next few weeks, Kaya and Miss Martha's bond deepened. Though she never pushed him to talk, Kaya found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't with anyone since his mother's death. He didn't tell her everything, not about the betrayal, the lies, or the money, but he did tell her about how much he missed his mother, about how he felt like he didn't belong in his own home. One afternoon, as they sat on their usual bench beneath the shade of an ancient oak, Kaya finally asked Miss Martha a question that had been on his mind for days. "How do you keep going when everything feels so wrong?" Miss Martha looked at him with her warm, wise eyes. "Oh, child, life will knock you down more times than you can count. But you have to remember, you're stronger than you think. Grief and pain can make you feel like you're drowning, but the fact that you're here, sitting in this park, talking to me, that means you're still fighting. And as long as you're fighting, there's hope." Kaya let her words sink in, feeling a small, fragile glimmer of hope stirring within him. He realized that, despite everything, he wasn't completely alone. Miss Martha was the first person since his mother's death who made him feel seen, like his pain mattered. Before he left the park that day, Miss Martha pressed a small, well-worn book into his hands. "It's a collection of poems," she explained. "These words helped me through some dark times. Maybe they'll help you too." Kaya took the book home and, late that night, after Rebecca's shrill voice had finally quieted, he opened it. The poem spoke of loss, grief, and resilience, things Kaya understood too well. For the first time in what felt like months, he felt a connection to something larger than his pain. Miss Martha had given him a gift far greater than the book. She had given him a way to start healing. As much as Kaya found solace in his afternoons at the park with Miss Martha, the situation at home grew increasingly unbearable. Rebecca's cruelty escalated, her barbs more pointed and her disdain more open. She would berate Kaya for the smallest infractions, leaving a dish in the sink, being home late from school, or simply being in the way. Alan remained distant, a ghost in his own house, avoiding conflict at all costs. One evening, after an especially harsh confrontation with Rebecca, Kaya locked himself in his room, fighting back tears of frustration and exhaustion. She had accused him of being lazy, ungrateful, and a burden, words that cut deep because, on some level, Kaya believed them. He felt powerless, trapped in a life where he had no control, no voice, and no future. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became, he couldn't stay here any longer. He had no money, no plan, but staying in this house was slowly breaking him. Kaya began formulating a plan. He had some spare change saved up from his allowance, and he figured he could hide a few of his belongings in his backpack. If he could just hold out for a little longer, he'd find a way to leave. But the thought of being homeless in the streets of Savannah terrified him. Despite his fear, the idea of running away felt like his only option. The house that was supposed to be his home had become a prison, and the longer he stayed, the more he feared losing himself completely. While Kaya was secretly planning his escape, he continued to dig deeper into his suspicions about his mother's death. He still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way his father and Rebecca spoke in hushed tones, the secrecy surrounding the inheritance, and the strange, disjointed conversations about money, it all pointed to something much darker than a simple car accident. One evening, Kaya waited until Alan and Rebecca had gone to bed, then sneaked into his father's office again. This time, he was more thorough, going through every drawer, every file, and every document. And that's when he found it, a letter from his mother, hidden in the back of a drawer, crumpled and stained. The letter was addressed to a lawyer. In it, his mother wrote about her intention to file for divorce. She spoke of her fears about Alan's temper and Rebecca's growing influence over him. She mentioned the inheritance and her concerns that Alan would try to take control of it. The last lines made Kaya's blood run cold. "I fear for my safety, and for Kaya's. I don't know who I can trust anymore." Kaya's hands shook as he read the letter over and over again, his heart pounding in his chest. His mother hadn't just died in an accident. She had been trying to leave his father, to protect him from something terrible, and now she was gone. Had Alan known about this? Had he done something to stop her? The weight of this realization settled heavily on Kaya's shoulders. His mother's death was no accident, it was part of a much larger, darker scheme. And now, Kaya knew too much. Fueled by anger and a desperate need for answers, Kaya confronted his father the next morning. He had the letter clutched in his hand as he stormed into Alan's office, his voice shaking with fury. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" Kaya demanded, thrusting the letter at his father. Alan's face paled as he read the familiar handwriting. He didn't say a word, his eyes darting from the letter to Kaya's face. It was the first time Kaya had seen real fear in his father's eyes, and it only confirmed what he already knew: Alan had been hiding something. "Did you know she was leaving you?" Kaya continued, his voice rising. "Were you trying to take the money? Did you have something to do with her death?" Alan finally spoke, his voice low and shaky. "Kaya, you don't understand. It's not that simple." "Then explain it to me," Kaya yelled, his hands trembling with rage. "You've lied to me this whole time. You let me think it was just an accident, but it wasn't, was it?" Alan ran a hand through his hair, avoiding Kaya's gaze. "Your mother, she was going to leave. But things got complicated. There was a lot of money involved, and Rebecca." Kaya's heart dropped at the mention of Rebecca's name. "What about her? What did she do?" Alan hesitated, and Kaya saw the cracks in his father's facade. "She convinced me to let things happen as they did. Your mother's death, it wasn't planned, not the way you're thinking. But we didn't stop it either." Kaya felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. His father's confession was worse than he'd imagined. It wasn't just that they had lied, it was that they had let his mother die for money. Kaya's world, already shattered, now felt like it was beyond repair. "I can't stay here anymore," Kaya whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're not my father. You're a monster." Without waiting for a response, Kaya turned and ran out of the office, tears blurring his vision. He had to get out of the house, out of the city, away from the people who had destroyed his life. That night, Kaya put his plan into action. He packed a small backpack with clothes, the poetry book Miss Martha had given him, and the few dollars he had saved. His heart raced as he crept through the house, careful not to wake Rebecca or Alan. He had no clear destination in mind, only a desperate need to leave the toxic environment that had suffocated him for far too long. Kaya slipped out of the apartment and into the cool night air of Savannah. The streets were quiet, the distant sound of traffic and the occasional clatter of footsteps echoing in the distance. He made his way through the familiar neighborhoods, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. As he passed by Forsyth Park, he paused for a moment, staring at the bench where he had spent so many afternoons with Miss Martha. He wanted to go to her, to tell her everything, but he couldn't bring himself to burden her with his problems. She had done enough for him already. Instead, Kaya kept walking, his thoughts racing as fast as his feet. He didn't know where he was going, but one thing was clear: he couldn't turn back now. The road ahead was uncertain, and the challenges would be immense, but Kaya knew he had to keep moving forward. He had to survive, for his mother's sake, and for his own. Kaya wandered through the streets of Savannah, unsure of his next move. The city, once filled with memories of his mother and the warmth of their old home, now seemed vast and unfamiliar. The bright streetlights cast long shadows on the empty sidewalks, making the city feel more like a maze than a sanctuary. He hadn't eaten since lunch, and the gnawing hunger in his stomach was beginning to cloud his thoughts. Still, he pushed forward, determined to stay away from his father and Rebecca. Forsyth Park seemed like the only place he could go, so Kaya found himself gravitating toward it once again. But this time, there was no Miss Martha sitting on the bench, no friendly face to offer comfort. The park, like the rest of the city, felt colder at night, its usually vibrant atmosphere replaced by eerie silence. Kaya sat down on the bench, pulling his jacket tighter around himself as a cool breeze rustled the leaves above him. He glanced down at the poetry book in his hands, flipping through the pages absent-mindedly. The words that had once brought him a glimmer of peace now seemed distant, as though they belonged to a world he no longer recognized. As the night wore on, exhaustion set in, and Kaya's eyes began to droop. He didn't know where he would sleep, he had no money for a motel, and the thought of wandering around the city until morning filled him with dread. Before he could make a decision, though, his body gave in to fatigue, and he fell into a restless sleep on the park bench, the poetry book clutched tightly to his chest.